So maybe you saw our review of the ASUS ROG PG32UQ last year. You probably thought it looked a fantastic gaming monitor, but priced at over £3,000, it is ridiculously expensive. Well, that's where the PG32UQ non-X model comes in. It still offers the same 4K resolution, 144Hz refresh rate, and HDMI 2.1 ports, but now at £849. So how did ASUS do it, and is it still worth buying? That's what we're going to find out today. Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are checking out the ASUS ROG PG32UQ 4K 144Hz monitor. As we already mentioned in that little introduction, the PG32UQ is the more affordable sibling of the PG32UQX that we reviewed last year. While both monitors may use the same IPS panel, the PG32UQ lacks mini LED dimming zones and no hardware G-Sync module that were found on its bigger brother. There's still Display HDR 600 certification though, quantum dot technology, and 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, all for a much lower price. Let's dive in and find out exactly what it's like to use this monitor in the real world. Kicking off with the design then, if you like the look of the PG32UQX, then the PG32UQ is still going to appeal. The core design between the two is pretty much identical, with the only real difference being that the non-X model has ditched the gold and copper accents, giving it a much more colour neutral appearance. Having said that, it is still very much a gaming monitor, especially when viewed from the back with the pattern ASUS is using, as well as the massive RGB ROG logo, but from the front it doesn't really bother me at all thanks to the bezel-less design on the top and sides with just a small bottom chin. We can also see the use of a wide metal stand, and thankfully this stand does offer a good array of ergonomic adjustments. That includes up to 100mm of height adjustment, swivel up to 25 degrees in both directions, and then we also have tilt from 25 degrees upwards to 5 degrees downwards. Just like the PG32UQX, we don't have any pivot or rotational functionality here, but VESA 100 mounts are supported if you have a custom monitor arm or wall mount. Despite its lower price tag, we actually find one key benefit to the PG32UQ versus the PG32UQX when looking at the monitor's I/O. So for starters, we have one DisplayPort 1.4, which is pretty standard, but most importantly, there are now 2 HDMI 2.1 ports. The PG32UQX was sadly limited to just HDMI 2.0 connectivity, but this is now corrected with the PG32UQ. Alongside that, we also have a 3.5mm audio jack and a 2-port USB 3.2 Gen 1 hub. We can also note that the OSD is controlled via a small joystick and 4 buttons underneath, and these are positioned on the back of the panel in the right hand corner as if you were looking at it from the front. On the topic of the OSD as well, I've never had any problems navigating the menus on other ASUS monitors, and thankfully it's no different here. There's plenty of gaming centric features too, including an on-screen crosshair and FPS counter, as well as 5 different overdrive modes that we will get to later on. The PG32UQ even features an overclocking option which boosts the refresh rate up to 155Hz. My one gripe about this OSD setup as a whole is admittedly very minor, but I do find it just a little bit annoying that you can't actually push the joystick in different directions to get to different quick access shortcuts. Instead, you have to depress the joystick by clicking it in and then use the buttons underneath. I personally would just find it a little bit easier to just flick the joystick to the left, for instance, if I want to quickly change my input, but it is what it is, and like I said, it's really not a big deal. That is really it for our look at the design of the monitor though. Like we said, it is basically the same thing as the PG32UQX with just a few smaller differences. Let's move on and talk about the panel quality though, starting off with our SpyderX colorimeter testing. Here, things get off to a very good start with our gamut testing. We see 100% sRGB and 100% Adobe RGB coverage, and then 95% reporting for the DCI P3 color space. That is a touch lower than ASUS's claimed 98% coverage, but I'd still say it's a very strong start for a gaming monitor. We can also see brightness is very solid, as we see a peak reading of 407 nits for the PG32UQ. I typically found myself using the screen at about 70%, so there is definitely plenty of headroom for those in particularly bright environments. The minimum brightness value of 76 nits is a bit less impressive though. For me, I would like to see this get much dimmer. We can also note that the contrast figure is very lackluster, reporting at just 540 to 1. Now, I have mentioned in a previous review that the SpyderX units can underreport contrast, and I do believe that is what is happening here. In any case, for an IPS panel, contrast is never going to be the greatest, so if you really love a punchy, contrasty image, you'll probably want to look at a VA screen. Thankfully, out of the box colour accuracy is a much stronger area for the PG32UQ, and to be completely honest, it is absolutely superb. We see an average delta E of just 0.63, which is frankly staggering, while only one of the 48 colour channels exceeded a delta E of 2. This figure did also improve ever so slightly after calibration, as we saw a new average delta E of 0.55, though it is safe to say ASUS did a stellar job with their factory calibration to begin with. So we've established this is a very good looking and colour accurate display, but what about its speed? That's where we're going to bring in the open source response time tool, which we've used to measure the response times of all 5 of the different overdrive modes on offer from the PG32UQ. Having said that, I am actually going to skip ahead and only show you starting with the 4th overdrive mode. The reason being is that the first 3 are honestly not that great. Response times are all fairly slow and there's basically no overshoot. For me, if you are going to use this screen, you can pretty much just ignore those 3 and jump straight ahead to the 4th level. As it turns out, I do think overdrive mode 4 is the best of the lot, though we can still see from the average grey to grey times, it's not that fast, with an average figure of 8.65 milliseconds. The panel also seems to have most trouble when dealing with the fall times, as we can see the slowest response time shown when transitioning from pure white or RGB 255, and you can see that in the bottom left corner of the heat map. So while this mode may not be the absolute fastest, the good news is there is still very little overshoot, making this the most usable of the 5 overdrive modes in my opinion. The reason I don't recommend the 5th overdrive mode is the excessive overshoot that is introduced. Grey to grey response times are much faster across the board, but at the cost of some excessive inverse ghosting, which honestly was really quite unpleasant to look at. And even then, we can still see the transitions from RGB 255 are still quite slow. For me, those results really do just illustrate why it would be so useful to have user configurable overdrive settings. Honestly, none of those 5 overdrive settings are that great. OD4 is still a little bit slow, whereas OD5 just introduces way too much overshoot. Something sitting between the two then probably would be the best compromise, but unfortunately ASUS just isn't giving us that option. If we go ahead and put those results into context then, the PG32UQ is sitting towards the bottom of our chart, though we do have plenty more monitors to test before this becomes a more comprehensive comparison. We can see that the PG32UQ isn't miles slower than the MSI MPG321URQD, however, and that is a similar 32-inch 4K 144Hz display. That being said, the EVE Spectrum is a class apart in terms of its response times, sitting at the top of the chart. As for how these results translate into real world use, while I definitely wouldn't say the PG32UQ is going to be bad for gaming, there are definitely noticeably faster screens out there. I still had a good time playing Forza Horizon 5 on this screen, as well as some Call of Duty 2, with the high resolution offering exceptional clarity, and this is just let down by the small amount of visible ghosting due to those slower response times. I actually switched back to the EVE Spectrum for a couple of hours, and honestly my eyes really did spot the difference. If you're playing slower paced RPG style games, it's probably not going to be as much of a problem, but for faster paced FPS titles, you definitely will spot the difference between this and a faster display. Thankfully though, system latency is not a problem for the PG32UQ when tested with Nvidia's LDAP tool. It offers essentially the same click-to-fire times as the EVE Spectrum and the AOC U28 G2XU, and actually the only screens we have tested that can do better are lower resolution and higher refresh rate, so you're honestly unlikely to get better latency from a 4K 144Hz display. Still on the topic of gaming as well, the PG32UQ does support Nvidia G-Sync, though it doesn't have a hardware module as we saw on the PG32UQX, but it is still officially certified as Nvidia G-Sync compatible. As always, I did all of my testing with an RTX 3090 with G-Sync enables and had absolutely no issues, so it's great to see that official certification. The main compromise between the PG32UQ and the PG32UQX, however, comes down to HDR. So the non-X model has done away completely with the mini LED dimming zones, and it also doesn't get nearly quite so bright as its more expensive sibling. With Display HDR 600 certification, it also only offers 16 edge-lit dimming zones, and in my opinion, the overall HDR experience just doesn't quite do it for me. I did notice some better image detail in the highlights of Night City, but there's also noticeable haloing around your cursor as it moves, and I even noticed the edge-lit LEDs turning on and off in different scenarios, which was frankly quite distracting. In my view, HDR 600 just isn't quite enough for a truly satisfactory HDR experience. It is definitely better than HDR 400, but the edge-lit dimming zones just can't really give you enough contrast for a properly impressive HDR experience. Rounding out the review then with a look at the viewing angles, as we'd expect from an IPS panel at this price point, there is absolutely no issues here. I did notice a touch of IPS glow when looking at it from different angles, which is to be expected, but the colours themselves remained very, very solid. Backlight bleed though is a little bit more of a problem, as I did notice two hotspots in both of the bottom corners on my sample. Now of course this will vary from model to model, but for me it wasn't even that distracting, it is just something worth pointing out. Overall then, the PG32UQ is a very solid 4K 144Hz gaming monitor from ASUS. With excellent image quality and two HDMI 2.1 ports, this screen is likely to have strong appeal if you own a PS5 or Xbox Series X, while of course PC users also find a lot to like, with official G-Sync compatibility and plenty of gaming-centric OSD features as well. The main thing just holding me back from being more positive about this screen comes down to its response times. It is just too slow for my liking in the 4th overdrive mode, while the 5th overdrive mode is faster but also introduces a ton of overshoot. It would definitely help if we had user configurable overdrive, and to be honest, I really wish more manufacturers would give us that option. Considering the £849 price tag though, it is clearly going to be much more attainable than the PG32UQX, and actually its pricing also puts it a little bit cheaper than its closely matched rival, the MSI MPG 321URQD. So if you are in the market for a large 4K high refresh rate gaming monitor, the PG32UQ is definitely worth looking at. That's going to do it for this video though, guys, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. You can also subscribe if you haven't already and ding that notification bell, and why not come chat with us on our Discord server, which is linked in the description. While you're there, you can also find another link to our merch store, and if you're feeling particularly generous today, you could even consider backing us on Patreon. That's going to do it for this one though, guys. I'm Dominic 4K Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.